We'll just wait while people join us. We've just started the event. To those of us you joining, my name's Dr. Steve Willey. I'm the academic co-director of environmental education projects here at Birkbeck. And this event is running as part of the Birkbeck Climate Festival. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the event. Across the festival, we've been really thrilled to showcase such a diverse range of topics and conversations. And the festival has been designed to foster interdisciplinary thinking and creative solutions to the pressing environmental challenges that we face. Tonight's event brings together PhD students from a variety of disciplines and is a collaboration between Birkbeck, University of London, and Royal Holloway, University of London, with speakers from both institutions. So the format of this event is each speaker will give a brief talk, and then after we've got through the 4 talks we should have, we'll take some questions. We won't be able to, because we're doing a town hall, we won't be able to see or hear you. So if you have a question, the best thing to do is use the Q&A function and type it into the chat. Sorry, type it into the Q&A. And that means when we get to the Q&A, I can kind of revoice the question and we can have it in the room and respond. So we are due to have we were due to have 5 speakers. Shani Cadwallender can't make it, unfortunately, this evening, and we're still trying to get the other speaker, our last speaker, Angie Hsu, into the room. But we're going to begin with the 3 that we have. So I will introduce each in turn, and then we'll run through in that order. So first of all, we have Pooja Kini from Birkbeck. The title of their thesis is Climate Change in Urban India: Intersectional and Intergenerational Gendered Experiences of Water Stress, and that's funded through the Mark James Studentship. Next, we have Olivia Allison from Birkbeck, and their thesis title is Remembering Ammonia's Past, Present and Future Disasters. And their supervisors are Grace Howden and Penny Newell. And I should have said Pooja's supervisors are Dr. Mara Nogueira and Dr. Penny Vera Sanso. And we also have Kae Rose from Birkbeck, and their thesis title is Urban Solarpunk, Restoring the Post-Colonial City, and that's funded by AHRC Chase. And their supervisor is Caroline Edwards. So what we're going to do now is I'll hand over to Pooja to present, then Olivia, then Kae, and hopefully we'll be joined by Angie at the end, and then we'll have a discussion between the 3 or 4 of us, and then we'll take some of the questions that you've hopefully left in the chat. So thank you very much for joining us and being part of the event. Pooja, over to you. I'm going to mute my camera and my mic just while you give your talk.
All right. Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for this platform. Let me just try and share my presentation to start with. And let me know once you can see it.
Yeah, it looks good to me. I can see it.
Yeah. Right. So I'm going to talk about my PhD thesis, which is on intersectional and intergenerational gendered experiences of water infrastructure in urban India. I'm right now in my 3rd year and writing up my thesis. The rationale of my thesis is that half of the world's 8 billion people will experience severe water scarcity. Because I work on India, which is one of the 17 countries facing extreme high water stress, it also correlates with a majority of the population moving towards urban centers. And I work on cities, and that's important for my thesis. Talking about policies, global and national policies recognize gender and other social groups, but state climate action plans fail to acknowledge the complex interplay between climate change and social factors, such as religion, caste, class, age, and other factors such as migration status, where they live within the city, and other factors which I'll discuss during the presentation. In India, we have the country, and then we have different states. And for water specifically and climate plans, states are important because the plans are implemented based on the policies developed at the state level. And water is a state subject. 40% of the plans made at the state level do not recognize gender as a factor and the other intersectional identities that I mentioned. And my thesis is a critique of these plans at the state level. And that's the rationale. If you see the map presented, it shows the depth to water level, and it's taken from the Department of Water Resources. And the red is where it gets worse. And Jaipur, which is my field site, is located in a red area. That means that the groundwater level is sinking and it's really bad right now. Talking about aims and methods, and the primary aim is to explore intersectional and intergenerational gendered experiences of urban water. And I do this to inform the state and national water and climate change policies in India. Today, what I'll do is I'll talk about the availability, accessibility, the quality and reliability of water for domestic purposes. I do have other objectives, but I won't talk about them today. The field site, like I said, is Jaipur. It is a tier 2 city, which generally talking is what we call secondary cities. The aim is also to move away from metropolitan cities. You might have heard about Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, because there's a lot of literature on these cities, and tier 2 cities are not often spoken about in literature. Jaipur is a semi-arid city. When I was doing my field work in general, the temperature goes on about to 48 to 50 degrees Celsius in summers. And in monsoon, last year, we saw a lot of frequent urban flash floods. So homes were flooded, the streets were flooded. I did my fieldwork for around 1 year between November 2023 to October 2024. And I used a qualitative comparative case study methodology. My study was based in 3 informal study settlements. By informal study settlements, I mean slums in our normal lingo. I did a 1 year fieldwork because I meant to cover seasonal aspects. That is the summer months, the winter months, and the monsoon months. And I also accounted for gaps for transcription, for some reflection between these seasonal months. Moving on to what my analytical framework was, I relied on feminist political ecology, which allowed for a gendered vulnerability to climate risk, which does not derive from the single factor of somebody being a woman. It looks at the social construction of gendered identities through the struggles and experiences of the environment. It explores how different gendered power relations and inequalities are continuously produced and reproduced specifically in urban spaces. The level of analysis for my thesis is at the body of the women. I also explore emotions of women when they access the environment. I'm not going to explore that today, but it's also a part of my thesis. Of course, intersectionality is also very important for me, which I will talk about. I just also want to talk a little bit about my study settlements. There are a lot of photos in my presentation, which does give some overview of what the settlements look like. These are my own photos. The informal settlements were in the foothills of the city of Jaipur. So Jaipur is surrounded by hills. And the informal city settlements tend to be pushed in the peri-urban areas of the city. The settlements were there for around 50 years. And in the last 50 years, the state was not able to provide water to these settlements. There was no state piped water supply. There was no sewer. There was no drainage connection. Out of the 3 settlements, 1 settlement in a tiny section had piped water supply. There was high reliance on groundwater, which had high fluoride, high nitrite. They had single pit toilets. There was open drainage. There was open garbage dumps, as you can see in the photos. The residents did not had land ownership, and as a result, they were deemed unauthorized and illegal by the state. About the residents themselves, the informal settlements are colloquially called as kachi bastis. That's the local term. In the number of residents, there were 2,005. One settlement had 2,000 households, one settlement had 500, and the third settlement had 50. The last census in India took place in 2011. There hasn't been a census after that, so these numbers are not official. These are just estimates. Most of the households were Hindu, and there was one settlement which was a mix of Hindu and Muslim. And that holds a lot of importance in my research because communal violence in the 1990s left an effect in the community. And a series of events in the last year, there was a communal clash which had implications on water access, and that resulted in intersectional vulnerabilities of Muslim residents in the settlement that I studied. And there was growing resentment of Hindu residents towards migrants and Muslim households. And it is very relevant in the context of India at the moment. In terms of livelihood, men tend to be daily wage workers, and women generally were economically unemployed and were engaged in household chores and childcare. There are very few women who were also daily wage workers and were employed in other activities. Caste is a factor in India. There's a caste-based hierarchy in Hindu religion. I'm not sure if some of you are aware, but there's a caste-based system in India like race or other intersectionalities. But most of the residents in informal settlement tend to be from the lower caste. Coming to the key findings that I would like to focus for today. In terms of availability of water, 100 liters per head was deemed as enough for residents of these settlements. And in comparison to the 150 liters provided to other areas in the city, because they thought that residents were less hygienic, they don't use flushes, they don't have toilets, they don't have drains. In terms of water infrastructure, as you can see in the photos, most of the households didn't have state water pipe supply. So they had to rely on public water infrastructures. That means that there was no water within the household and they had to go to a certain distance. And they had like public tanks, or they had a water tanker coming to the settlement for water. And these were provided by both state and non-state actors like private agencies or NGOs or political representatives. Talking about water infrastructure is not only physical, but also social. So people themselves acted as infrastructure, and that is what my thesis talks about. There are social aspects to infrastructure. Maintaining relationships was also important. In one of the settlements, they had watermen who acted as infrastructure because their job was to go and turn on and off the motor for a tank or a borewell. So maintaining relationship with the waterman was also important. So if you had a bad relationship with the person who turned on and off the motor, that meant that you would not get water. And all of this, your experience of access with water was defined by your identity and your subjectivity. Your gender, your caste, your class, your religion, your migration status defined your access to water. Your religion, if you're a Muslim or a Hindu, defined your access to water. Your vulnerability to climate change, your vulnerability to seasonality was defined by your intersectional experiences. And this was one of my key findings. there were daily disruptions to everyday availability and accessibility to water infrastructure, water flow, and pressure caused breakdown and hampered everyday practices. Like I said, these settlements were based on the base of foothills. That means, like you see in the photo on the right, there was an elevation. That means that water flow had to be, the water flow had to go up. That means a pressure had to be created with the help of motor pumps. Motor pumps were powered. That means there was frequent breakdown. Uh, in the months of summer, so that means there was a seasonal aspect to it. In the months of summer, there were frequent breakdowns because it was used so frequently that the pumps could not bear the usage. So there was a seasonal aspect to water usage and access. So there was a pressure politics associated with water access. Another finding that is very relevant for my study is the poor quality of water. Since there was high reliance to groundwater and there was a sinking groundwater level, also related to high fluoride, high nitrite, and the use of motor pumps. Restaurants had to bear the consequences of accessing poor quality of water. Um, Another key finding is water storage. Water had to be stored in underground tanks, which had to be built under their homes. Not everyone could afford those underground storage. And this was also an adaptation measure in times of uncertainty. So those who could afford those underground storages meant that they were uh, better adapted to uncertainty. So those who can afford motor pumps, those who can afford water storage practices were better adapted to climate risks. Those who could uh, better adapt to these seasonal practices were less prone to changes in seasons. I think, yeah, uh, these are some. I don't know how much time I took, but
That was perfect. Thank you so much, Pooja.
all
So
right.
interesting. I've got some questions already, but as we said, we'll save them. If anyone does have questions from our audience, do put them in the Q&A now because we'll come back to them at the end. I think just a very quick hello to Angie who's joined us. Angie, I'll introduce you when we get to you in the speaker list. Olivia, over to you. So this is Olivia Allison, remembering ammonia's past, present, and future disasters.
Hi. Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to talk about my PhD topic on ammonia. So I'm a first year student, just saying that to caveat slightly, probably. But I will be presenting about ammonia's fast, slow, and future disasters. And a sort of central question that I'm thinking about at the moment is how ammonia can help us to conceptualize violence. One of the key ideas that I'll be relying on or theories is Rob Nixon's theory of slow violence from 2011, which critiques our customary understanding of violence as an event that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space. So there's really an important element of kind of talking about temporality as well as spatial expanse in relation to slow violence. So if you think of, what we think about typically when we're talking about climate disasters or any kind of disaster, you're usually thinking about something that could appear on the news. Whereas his conceptualization of slow violence is in contrast to that violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, that's dispersed across time and space and may not be or is typically not viewed as violence at all. And so this is one of the key elements that I think it's really important to kind of imagine how do we conceptualize and give a name to slow violence when it is not a spectacle. Another useful theory is the hyperobjects theory. And so this is from Timothy Morton, 2013. And that really goes a bit farther. and really conceptualizing climate change as one of numerous hyperobjects, which occur, as he says, on such vast temporal and spatial planes that we can't really grasp them. So the kind of it's a longer story and involving quantum physics and various other things, but in general, we can only really see the indications of a hyperobject or maybe look at some particular part, but we really, as humans, we cannot grasp the whole thing. And so I think both of these theories and the way I'll be using them in my PhD is really thinking about the types of disasters that we really struggle to conceptualize as humans and that we conceptualize to kind of put an image to. Returning to Nixon on that, he really makes a call for a political, imaginative, and theoretical rethink in order to convert into image and narrative the disasters that are slow moving and long in the making. And in particular, I think this phrase, disasters that are anonymous and star nobody, has really been a useful conceptualization for me when I'm thinking about ammonia, because I think what this project is really doing is casting ammonia in this role as an anonymous star that is able to dramatize chemical disasters along various temporalities. So that's a quick theoretical introduction. Now I want to talk more practically, why ammonia? Ammonia is a really interesting chemical because it appears it's very pervasive, but it's also sort of culturally anonymous or invisible. And that's similar in a way to its actual chemical, properties. It's a colorless, invisible, toxic gas that's used in explosives and also in fertilizers. So I'm interested in that kind of duality between life and death that's already kind of inherent in its chemical properties. It comes naturally from manure, and it's manufactured more prominently now industrially from natural gas through the Haber-Bosch process. You can also make it from hydrogen, but that's pretty rare at the moment, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Ammonium nitrate is a good example of a chemical salt that comes from ammonia. So the common ammonia salt, and this is really used in fertilizers, but it's also the most common chemical in improvised explosive devices. And ammonia is really, I think, again, thinking about these like anonymous stars and why ammonia is a good chemical that can play this role is it really is appearing a lot of different places. It has a lot of different types of toxicity and also uses, but we don't kind of think about it culturally very often. I will be then looking at the different types of disasters, categorizing them along the sort of temporality lines used by Rob Nixon. Ammonia's fast disasters are usually explosions. So these could be deliberate kind of explosions like in Oklahoma City in 1995 in the US, but also accidental. There's been a lot of these, for example, the Beirut port, which is in the picture, Texas City, 1947, which is the largest US industrial disaster. There's also a very early ammonia explosion in the UK that was basically covered up by UK authorities because they didn't want people to think that having explosives being made in their backyard was dangerous. And then there's also leaks and transport accidents that are basically constant and ongoing and happening at a lot of different types of industrial factories, such as chicken plants. It's used as a coolant. There's a lot of different types of ammonia leaks that are very toxic and happening kind of all the time, but again, semi-invisibly. Ammonia slow disasters are less spectacular. So obviously fast disasters can be kind of, they come up in news alerts. They often appear, as a big spectacle, but slow disasters are much harder to conceptualize, as Rob Nixon has already mentioned. There's a couple of these that are really relevant here. So soil acidity and in general depletion of nutrients from soil because of its heavy use in agriculture. The use in agriculture also leads to water pollution and aquatic dead zones. So the nitrates from ammonium nitrate runs off into water, polluting water sources. And also, this is a picture of how large the aquatic dead zone is in the US in the Gulf of Mexico. And then finally, ammonia is a really big component in air pollution, one of the most important components in kind of smog, and has been named as one of the main causes in some of the areas where there's the worst air pollution as well. And again, these are less these are ongoing processes that are harder to conceptualize. And I think one of the useful things about ammonia is the difference and similarities between how ammonia's fast and slow disasters are responded to by governments, policymakers, and so on. But there's also future disasters. And this is where we sort of take ammonia, which is a toxic chemical, and also rethink it in our society as a so-called clean fuel. And so ammonia is basically being used to fuel ships. And there's some talk of using it for other kind of green, clean fuel. At the moment, almost all ammonia is coming from natural gas. And so it's still basically coming from the carbon economy, but being kind of rebranded to some degree as a clean fuel. So the critical research questions that I'll be looking at is really how do we construct and change the meanings of chemicals, and how do chemicals resist the meanings that we impose? So I'll be looking at that through a mix of semio-capitalism and new materialism. Semio-capitalism sort of arguing that we kind of impose different meanings, and the more that money, for example, becomes virtual and commodities also become virtually traded, it strips away any inherent meaning of capitalist commodities. And then at the same time, new materialism is arguing that things that would normally be an object also have some level of subjectivity in that they can, create and do create their own meanings. And I think that intersection is very interesting, because the more that we sort of decide ammonia is a fertilizer, or it's a clean fuel, it continues to resist those, often by leaking or exploding in ways that are basically unruly or resist those meanings that we're imposing on it. And then the next sort of idea that I'll be looking at is why and how do we react to disasters and the different temporalities, and how do laws and regulations determine who suffers? So this is partly drawing on slow violence, which I've already touched on, but I think going farther and looking also at administrative violence, where the laws about where ammonia can be handled, by whom, and how really determines who is allowed to suffer from ammonia pollution or leaks and who is not, and how do we decide how those things are done, and also kind of legislate that. And so looking also in spatial, temporal, space and time. And then finally, really looking at how do we become ignorant about a chemical like ammonia. So ammonia is, as I've said, kind of useful because it's not a spectacular chemical in itself. Oil, we imagine a lot of things about oil. We romanticize oil. There's a lot of kind of construction in a different way of what oil or some of the other kind of more famous nuclear weapons or something like that. Whereas ammonia is very pervasive and has been for kind of hundreds of years, but we sort of are able to remain ignorant about that. And so I want to interrogate how that is, and how we can use art to really remember and kind of reconstruct human and non-human experiences of disasters. So I'll also be working with creating a hybrid text that is based on archival and interview materials. This is the kind of example of an early poem that I wrote that's basically juxtaposing a kind of health incident report with an interview from media. So the health incident is sort of reporting a leak at a factory. And then there was an article that's also about like quoting the victims of that leak and what they experienced, and sort of juxtaposing official narratives and then the human experience of that type of disaster. And drawing on different influences like Claudia Rankine, Samia Heni, various others. Another really interesting book of poems about styrofoam and kind of other types of chemicals. So that the text will be a mix of nonfiction, kind of essay form, as well as poetry and visual collage. And I think that's all. Look forward to any questions that arise, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Olivia. So we're going to move on to Kae Rose from Birkbeck and their thesis, Urban Solarpunk, Restoring the Post-Colonial City. Thanks, Kae.
Thank you so much. And huge thanks to Olivia and Pooja. And yeah, very grateful to be here. I'm just going to try to share my screen. I know I had some glitches at the start, so I'll just see if it works. But if not, there are backup plans. Okay. Are those slides visible?
Yeah, they are. It's working. Just need to go to presenter view, but we can see them.
Yeah. Okay, that's really good news. Yeah, so the title of my thesis is Urban Solarpunk, Restoring or Restoring the Post-Colonial City. And I thought I'd try to do a kind of quick what, why, how kind of structure for introducing and giving a kind of rough and ready introduction to the thesis. I'm also a first year PhD student like Olivia, and so a lot of this is, it's very much work in progress and kind of emerging, but particularly with the why, I wanted to sort of track my I guess what brought me to the research, because there are sort of personal elements in that as well. So for the what, just to kind of briefly sketch out what the thesis is about, just referring to the abstract that I gave. So I'm kind of hovering around the areas of environmental and energy humanities. I think particularly this emerging area of energy humanities that looks at the way energy sources dictate, I guess, kind of certain cultural and storytelling forms. That's a kind of major framework for the thesis, and then particularly because of I'm also interested in urban areas in particular, and there's a kind of facet of the thesis that draws I guess on post-colonial theory broadly, in looking at intersectional approaches to eco-activism. But it is a literature thesis, contemporary literature, and specifically I'm looking at an emerging science fiction subgenre known as solarpunk, and I'll explain and define it a little bit more in a moment. I'm trying to look at solarpunk almost as a form of speculative design. So thinking about how the way that we tell different stories, especially about cities, might actually change the way that we design and interact with them. And I do, in the latter part of the thesis, look at London specifically as a case study. So I'm doing some kind of analysis, and especially kind of narrative analysis of these anthologies of short stories, which often have transnational urban settings. And then I'm kind of putting that into dialogue with some kind of emerging poets and writers in London, and looking at, I guess, some kind of somewhat autoethnographic field research around eco-activism in London. And so to situate that, I guess I'm looking at some aspects of how eco-fiction progresses at certain key moments, and I'll speak to that in a moment as well. So why? So I wanted to take a slightly different approach to this, but something which I hope will be resonant, because definitely a few years ago, I never would have expected to be speaking at any kind of climate festival, and I feel that I do approach the topic from a somewhat naive perspective, but that's kind of built in as part of the inquiry and research, I think. So I'm just going to pull up my notes for this bit. Yeah. So just to situate, I guess, because I applied twice and failed the first time, and got in and got funding the second time. So I'd been thinking about this topic actually since kind of lockdown 2020, which was a very bad time, as we know, for me and for others. But there was something kind of interesting happening at the same time. So certainly, I think as many of us were at that time, there was very little to do other than kind of walk and kind of noticing certain events that would happen in local parks and so on, would be the sort of blooming of buds would be like a really big part of your day. And also, I think simultaneously, this prominence was given in the news stream to kind of the positive ecological impacts of lockdown, reduced emissions and visibility of wildlife and so on. So all of this stuff was kind of popping up and coming through both colloquially and through kind of social media and so on, and also through aspects of the news cycle. And this kind of led into, I guess, a sort of reading journey and thinking about this kind of discourse around climate crisis and imagination or storytelling. So this quotation from Amitav Ghosh, from a book called The Great Derangement: the climate crisis is a crisis of the imagination, or in David Wallace-Wells' book, The Uninhabitable Earth, again, a similar sort of accusation, right? So when it comes to contemplating real world warming dangers, we suffer from an incredible failure of imagination. And I felt curious about who the we was in those sentences, a failure of whose imagination. And so this is still broadly, speaks to some of the significant aspects of the thesis inquiry. So through this kind of, I think, period of, enormous anxiety in many ways, and wanting to read something which I guess presented in some ways a more hopeful futurism, I came across this genre, solarpunk, which is not only existent in these kind of recent collected anthologies of short stories produced over the last decade or so, but also this kind of thriving online community and sort of Reddit and Tumblr and YouTube and all of this kind of thing. And so becoming quite intrigued by this subgenre, and starting to trace this back through work by Octavia Butler in the 90s and the kind of critical SF of the 1970s, and thinking about actually you could trace this kind of lineage of sort of to some extent sort of critically utopian, ecologically informed science fiction back to something like this 1890s work by William Morris, for example, News from Nowhere, which re-envisages a kind of alternative future of London in the kind of pastoral mode. And I think notwithstanding all the work by Indigenous theorists and writers, which puts these contributions from diasporic writers into some kind of perspective. So and come back for a second. So in looking at solarpunk, just to, I guess, again, define the genre. So I would refer to it as a kind of critically utopian genre of storytelling, animating a desire for visions of the future that are not dystopian or technocratic, that are politically committed, and tries to explore futures that are based on principles of sustainability and renewable energies. And in this inquiry of the thesis, I guess I'm exploring how this kind of terminology for the genre relates to these histories and kind of critical moments, particularly in the 1970s and in the 1890s, of fiction, speculative fiction in particular, as a kind of reaction to industrialization and possible alternatives. So I'm just going to skip through a little bit. The other aspect of the thesis is the kind of autoethnographic or field research side. So what was interesting is that, I guess, through these stories, I started sort of noticing and experiencing my own city in a different way. I grew up in London, but had never really engaged with the kind of ecology of London in certain ways. And through engagement with these fictions, I began to notice just how thriving a set of communities there were who were working on kind of urban ecology, broadly speaking. And the shot that you can see here is from some journaling around the volunteering work that I do with a group called Permablitz. They're an urban permaculture group, and working on a variety of different spaces in the city, lots of work with community gardens. This particular day that was documented here was with an organisation called London's Community Kitchen, which engages with food waste. They also have a community garden, and they're looking into kind of urban agriculture. So all of this seemed to sort of relate in really interesting ways to these stories that were being told in the anthologies, and to provide a kind of antidote to sort of technocratic or dystopian narratives of the city. I think also really significant to say that the solarpunk anthologies kind of deliberately draw from a very eclectic range of origins. So there are contributions from really anywhere, you name it. I think there's a volume that's dedicated particularly to Southeast Asian fiction, contributors from India, from Barbados, from the Philippines, from many, many different parts of the world, and accessing the kind of, I guess, aspects of culture, language, storytelling that provide a sort of myriad perspective on the topic. And so the field research aspect, I'm particularly interested in London and in the UK on I guess historically problems around exclusivity or marginalization in kind of environmental movements, and ways to work better together in an issue such as the climate crisis, where there's a lot of calls for kind of togetherness and working together. So the Seeding Change report, for example, which was carried out by the London Wildlife Trust, looks at the barriers to nature conservation volunteering for young women and non-binary people of colour. There are also multiple kind of groups and organisers and activists who are trying to, I think, kind of promote different kinds of inclusivity in environmental movements in the UK. Outside with Lyra is a great Instagram to follow. This is a group that my partner works with, Flock Together, Black Birdwatching Group. Land in Our Names is a land reparations group active in London. And so all of this, I think, led me to think about how through these stories and through these groups who are telling different kinds of stories through their activism, questions of storytelling, I think are essential to climate justice movements, and a failure to kind of acknowledge that power in storytelling and who is narrating versus who is being narrated is really significant and kind of has real consequences. And for this aspect of the project, speculative design has been a really useful lens in thinking about how imaginaries and how stories can result in particular kinds of changes in what we can design and organize and plan together. So the thesis, again, quite sprawling at the moment, that has these different facets. So in terms of qualitative research, I'm particularly interested in the kind of infrastructures around publishing of these anthologies as well. So I'm carrying out some interviews with solarpunk editors and writers, field research through my own volunteering in urban permaculture, which has authored ethnographic elements as well. In terms of the theoretical framework, again, fairly eclectic, but I think post-colonial critical race theory is really crucial. Notions around kind of challenging or queering the pastoral as a genre, and most dominantly the environmental and energy humanities as well. And then in terms of literary study, narratology is really important to the project as a way of looking at how forms of narrative affect the way that we interact with our real world environments. And also looking at notions of paratext and megatext, which to be really succinct about those. So paratext, particularly in the anthologies, looking at the way that author biographies, that the covers, that the blurbs, that the even in one anthology, you know, a QR code which invites readers to kind of interact with the people that put the anthology together. So looking at these kind of additional texts around the stories that affect the way that readers interact and the way that a sort of movement is built through the text. And then in terms of megatext, also looking at these additional surrounding kind of worlds around the stories, often which happen online. So, for example, the kind of Reddit thought forums and Tumblr posts and YouTube channels that have also sprung up around this subgenre, and looking at the way that affects the modes of storytelling. And I think that is it.
Thanks so much, Kae. So we'll move to our final speaker, Angie Hsu. Thank you so much, Angie, for joining us. And sorry you had a bit of problem with the join link. I think that's on us.
Sure. So hi everyone. I mean, this is a chapter of my thesis. It's actually not the title of my thesis, but yeah. But overall, my thesis is basically documenting the history of deforestation in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and its relation to colonial history, as well as recent forest conservation and restoration efforts that utilize decolonial approaches in returning land sovereignty to indigenous people, as well as helping to restore native species and mitigate climate change. So that's the overall arc of the thesis. This is just chapter 2. And this is a case study that is done in the Indonesian Borneo. It's called Safeguarding Planetary Health and Protecting Tropical Forest Carbon Through Radical Listening. And before we start, I'll give you like a background of what kind of motivated my research. So as we all know, the global histories of empire and colonialism are crucial for understanding the roots of ecological destruction. as Amitav Ghosh argues in The Nomad's Curse, anthropogenic climate change and the exploitation of the Earth biosphere are intimately linked to colonialism. The colonial power justified their domination over native lands, people, and earthlings by reducing living beings into the commodities and indigenous people into brutes. So building on Ghosh's argument, I argue that although colonialism has disrupted native biodiversity and the interrelatedness of all life forms that are central to the culture of many indigenous communities, both the landscape and the people can recover from the traumatic disruptions through the practice of reclaiming land rights and narratives. So we'll start. So most of, can you turn to the second slide? I realized I couldn't. Second slide, please. Yeah, so as you know, like the main area of my research is in the tropics, and obviously we all know that the tropical forest holds a large amount of carbon. So according to the World Resources Institute, forest conservation and restoration has the potential to provide 23% of the climate mitigation solution. And in particular, within the landscape sector, tropical forest has the potential to deliver 63% of the landscape sector's mitigation potential by 2030. So not only are tropical forests carbon sinks, they're also really important really important habitat for half of the Earth's planet and animal species. And in addition to that, forests managed by indigenous people and local communities currently hold 300 million tons of carbon. So as you can see, the carbon, they're largely stored in the tropical areas, in the Congo Basin, the Amazonian rainforest, and then the northern part of India, all the way stretching to Indonesian Borneo, then to New Guinea. And this is a map that's done by this is called the Forest Research Institute, I believe, and they map that with the areas that are currently under threat. So as you can see from the map, the parts in Southeast Asia, as well as Central Africa, and obviously the Amazon are the areas that are highly threatened, but they're also highly crucial for the planet's climate future. So this is the reason that most of my research are in these areas. And there's a prose nonfiction project that document different case studies of organization working with local communities. Can you do the next slide, please? So, since it's called planetary health, I'll just briefly explain. Planetary health is a term that describes how the health of the human population depends on the health of the ecosystems. And I'll use the example of tropical deforestation to show you how the two are interlinked. So many indigenous communities are caught in the vicious cycle of logging and deforesting the forest for economic pressure, a lack of healthcare, and a limited access to any alternative livelihoods. So they might initially start with logging into the forest to extract timber and sell it to the international market, and which leads to further forest degradation and increased vulnerability. And after that, you'll see soil degradation, soil erosion, and the water cycle it disrupts. So if you lose the forest, you will eventually gradually lose the rainfall. So that leads to disruption of water cycle, and that leads to further poverty and forest degradation. And then the lack of sustainable income meant that they will have to further degrade the land. So how do you break free from this vicious cycle? And this is a case study that is done by two sister organizations, Health and Harmony and Alan Sahad Lusteri. So this is a case study on how radical listening help indigenous community to break free from the vicious cycle and to live in harmony with healthy forests. The next slide, please. So basically, radical listening is a way of facilitating community design holistic solution to address the interlinked climate and justice crises. As I mentioned before, this is a project that has been on the ground for 17 years by two sister organizations. The location is in the Gunung Puno National Park, West Kalimantan, Indonesian Borneo. This is also the home to valuable endangered Borneo orangutans. And the problem, as I mentioned before, is logging that leads to degradation. This is a community that is incredibly impoverished, so they rely on logging for their main livelihoods, but it's not out of their own will. It's just simply the lack of access to healthcare and other education, other opportunities outside of a very remote area. So what Health and Harmony and Alan Sahalastri did was a 400 hours of radical listening meetings with all the communities around the Gunung Puno National Park, 21 villages in total. Can you, next slide, please? So, so why is it called radical listening, and in what way is it radical? In the realm of conservation and restoration practices, as well as developmental aid, the voices of indigenous communities are often not heard due to a long history of colonialism and neo-colonial policies that rejects local expertise. This is typically the case because of the fact that funders' priorities are usually being emphasized. So what the funder wants tends to outweigh what indigenous people want. So you get fundings that are sort of channeled into to the land to plant trees that the indigenous community don't necessarily want, or that there's a misalignment between, say, the NGOs in the global north and the sort of what they call the beneficiaries in some of the impoverished communities in the global south. So I find this, so radical listening is a term coined by Dr. Kennedy Webb, so it's not my term. And I find it really interesting. I was immediately drawn to this term because I obviously recall one of the essay by Gayatri Spivak, one of the very important post-colonial scholar on Can the Subaltern Speak? But essentially, it's about a power structure that disallows indigenous people from being heard. So the question is not can the subaltern speak, but can people who are colonizer or settler colonizer listen? So radical listening is basically tackling this kind of a power structure. It's not asking whether these people can speak or whether it's asking whether the people who has the power, whether they're actually paying attention to what's being said. So essentially radical listening, and obviously the word radical coming from the Latin root, radix meaning roots. So it's a deep listening practice that seeks to find out the root causes of environmental degradation. And it's not just passive listening. After listening, you're expected to invest in precisely what the community asks. So next page, please. So these are the 4 elements of radical listening. And I think it's just because of time, I'm just going to focus mainly on interbeing, although the 4 elements are equally important. So interbeing, it's a concept that's developed by the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, and he is arguing that in the Buddhist principle of interdependent rising, nothing exists on its own. Everything is interrelated to one another, and this idea can be used to explain the relation we have with rainforest communities. That even though we live in a very different part of the world from their communities, that if the forest is not thriving in that part of the world, that also means that because of climate and because of the way carbon works, and how everything is connected, and water pattern as well. So if they are not thriving in the tropics, it's quite likely that people in other parts of the world aren't thriving. So that's the importance of understanding interbeing as a prerequisite of how to practice radical listening. So with that said, could you move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so there are different layers of radical listening and that we can practice. And this is what the organization gave out as teaching people to practice radical listening. With the first layer, you simply practice to be present and to listen to your own senses. And then with the second layer of it, you need to practice listening to each other, especially people who come from an entirely different culture from yours, and sort of listening with no judgments. So like actually being open to your differences. And then the final layer of the listening would be practice listening to an entire group. And when you're listening, you frame the question that you ask the group in terms of reciprocity. So, for instance, you can ask, say, "Thank you for being a citizen of the world. What kind of gift would you like for us to thank you for protecting forests?" I mean, that's one of the positive ways of framing this question to a group. And when you're listening to the group, you're listening to a sort of emergence moment where the group the group kind of consciousness arises. They sort of come in agreements. For instance, they might all agree on, yes, we need to start deforestation. And they would propose how they're going to do that. And that's the moment you're looking for when you're listening to a whole group. So next slide, please. Yes. So based on the radical listening sessions, they develop 4 different strategies to deal with the poverty and illegal logging problems. And I don't think we have time for all the programs they run, but just to give you a brief summary, they run a garden to forest program, organic agriculture program, chainsaw buyback program. Basically, they pay for the chainsaw that you use, and they give you a microfinance so that you can start a business without deforesting the land. And then they run a reforestation program, which I've been in Lamon Satong and Sarahan. And then the final one is mobile clinic, which is they drive kind of a van and to the remote villages and to provide them with health care from a certain day for a certain day in a week or a month. Okay, next slide, please. So these are the results. So this is pretty remarkable. This is a paper published by external organization. They found that the project implementation by HIH and SRI in between 2007 to 2017, that's a 10-year period, they see a remarkable 70% reduction in deforestation rate. In addition, they saw 52,000 acres of forest growing back, and the local says that the forest hills are now bringing more water. Good news. All right, the next slide, please. Okay, and I think the final aspect of radical listening, which wasn't originally designed within HIH and Health and Harmony's program, is listening to the more than humans. So we've already talked about how listening can transform human relationship with the forest. But what if we expand that practice beyond the humans, towards the ecosystem, towards wildlife, and the intelligence of the entire world? And this is a question I ask. So forest is obviously inhabited by humans like us, but then there are also the mycelial networks, the chemical signals, and the animals, how they call out to each other. And so I've got a short audio clip. If you want, you can click on that. You can just listen. Can you hear it? Mm-hmm. No? Ooh. Can you hear anything or? No. Oh,
it's because I'm on mute, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I could hear a lot. Could you not hear? Not hear that?
No,
I'm sorry. My microphone's on, so I was listening to some lovely forest sounds with what sounded like monkey calls in the background. But I don't think I'll be able to sort out my sounds if it wasn't working for you. I can try one more time. Let me try one more time with the PowerPoint, and if it works,
I mean, I could do it from my end as well.
Where's the PowerPoint gone now?
We can hear it.
You can hear it now? Okay. just looking for Angie's presentation now on PowerPoint.
I'm sharing from, can you hear it from mine? Yeah.
Yes.
We could hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and find Angie's PowerPoint again. 1 second. There it was. Okay, I got it. Okay, share. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just skip through.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Is this the next slide? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I know we're going over time, but I think I'd like to hear the end of Angie's presentation. And then if the speakers are available to stay a bit longer, we can have at least some conversation. I appreciate if our audience need to go, but if at least our speakers are okay to stay a bit longer, then I think we'll just run over.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Should I do like, I mean, this is basically just a quick summary of what I've said. Radical listening as a colonial remedy. So I did another podcast interview with Nina Finley from Health and Harmony. So I mean, this is argument that we both agreed on. So colonialism was built upon a set of hierarchical relationships that justify the exploitation of landed people. And radical listening challenges this hierarchical relationship and seeks to restore a mutualistic relationship through interbeing. It includes listening to both indigenous community and the more than human world. And thank you for listening. Okay. Yeah, and I've got a podcast that's on, on environmental justice and decolonization, ecosystem conservation and restoration, environmental justice and decolonization. All right, there you go.
Thanks so much.
Everything.
Well, I'm just looking at the Q&A, and I asked a few questions, but I'm kind of keen to leave space for you to reflect on each other's papers. But we do have one question that's come in from the audience, so let's prioritize that. And the question was, I'm really curious what the term queering the pastoral means, and my question is to Kae for that.
Yes.
It says beneath.
Yeah, so oh, thank you. I guess this refers to kind of romantic traditions of the pastoral, which kind of fetishizes like idyllic country living and kind of green rolling fields and beautiful landscapes, and renders invisible the kind of labor relations, particularly that underpin the ability for somebody to kind of go and take a beautiful countryside walk or something like that. And also questions around, I guess, dating all the way back to sort of like 13th century processes of enclosure and kind of land ownership in England as well. And so yeah, so queering the pastoral, I guess, kind of subverting the gaze on the countryside and looking at what's visible and what's not visible in a kind of pastoral landscape. In the literary tradition, I'm kind of looking at that in literary settings and looking at maybe genres of writing about the land that kind of refuse the kind of idealizations of pastoral genres. Yeah, so that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it, but it's still, yeah, it's something as a first year I'm grappling with and getting to know myself, but it's certainly working sort of with and against certain representational or kind of genre conventions around the pastoral as a sort of simplified or idealized relationship to land.
Thanks, Kae. If there are any other questions from our audience, do please just put them in the Q&A space, and I'll read them out and we'll visit them. I was just looking down, and if I didn't say thank you, Angie, by the way, thank you for your paper. I think I did, but perhaps I'm not. Thank you. I was looking. There's been quite an interesting exchange around where Pooja's kind of engaging with Olivia's kind of presentation of Nixon's term "slow violence" in the chat, and I wondered, Pooja, maybe you could say a bit more about that, about the degree to which some of the things you were saying around the way in which subjectivity mediates water access is usefully conceptualized as a form of violence, and if so, at kind of what temporality does that violence operate at? Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I think I missed or did not address that in my presentation, but a very important aspect of my thesis is slow infrastructural violence. And I look at the everyday lived experiences of women and the emotional aspects of it. And I focus on the embodied level. And by that, I mean how it's an everyday issue and not the exception, because a lot of time climate events are treated as exceptional. I don't do that. I look at it as an everyday issue because what the residents of my settlements deal with are everyday instances. Water scarcity, water stress, because they don't have state supply. They're living with these stresses every single day. So I do not want to say that these are exceptional events or these are once in a month or once in a year events. These are everyday lived experiences, and that's the scale that we are dealing with. And when I study seasons, because I was there for 1 year, that's when I study urban seasonality. I had the opportunity to study the spatial temporal scale through seasons, but that gives me the opportunity to study a shorter period, a day, the everyday, but it also gives me the opportunity to imagine a longer period, a climate, 30 years, which is foreseeable. And because I also, through interviews, life stories, was able to revisit the past experiences of urban flash floods and was able to see how subjectivities were produced in the past and compare how things went on in the past to their present experiences. And that was really useful. And some findings reflect how everyday present versus what went on in the past was not very different. And what was going on in the present was the same maybe 20 years ago. So there was not really any difference in the time scale for 20, 30 years because there was no state supply for the 50-year period of their establishment. So in terms of time scales, I would say I'm looking at everyday slow infrastructural violence, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it absolutely does. And I think de-exceptionalizing our sense of what climate degradation and climate violence is, and rooting it in the everyday makes a great deal of sense to me. Olivia, I saw you raise your hand, or is that yeah? Come in.
Yeah, I was just looking for the hand button, but I thought I'd use the old-fashioned method. I just was curious about, like, also in time, in terms of your method, whether, yeah, those memories of previous flash floods or other kind of events also collapses, I guess, in people's memory, right? Like you may have a kind of memory that you're constantly referring to or that stays somehow present in your everyday, many years after that, if it's a traumatic event.
Yeah, I mean, and it was also very difficult because what one person says is very subjective to their experiences versus what somebody else might say. It was also very different to what somebody else might say. And I got very confused because I was hearing their stories 20 years hence and maybe 5 years hence. And it was very difficult to sort of summarize in my thesis. And I stopped myself and I was like, why am I trying to do that? I don't need to. It's their experience. I just need to write as is and just accept it. It's their story and just provide a background that it's said by so and so person. It's their reality and just try to understand why they're trying to say it. So it's their memory. It's their water memory. And there's a reason why they present it to me and also place my positionality to their subjectivity. So try to understand my positionality in their eyes and why they present their memory to me the way they do, and their emotions the way they do to me. So it's not only their memory, it's also my positionality to their subjectivity. And then try to understand it in that way, I guess.
Thanks so much. Olivia, maybe I can quickly come to the question I put down for you, which was it was inspired by this talk I went to yesterday around sustainability when it comes to pet care, and this remarkable chart that was shown, which was as this particular parasiticide was banned for agricultural use, the market share dropped, but then that was matched by an increase in market share for the use of these parasiticides in pets. And I guess it's really a question about, could you tell me a bit more about the regulatory markets, regulatory structures around ammonia? But like I said here, Pooja's question around visibility and invisibility is related to it, but it's kind of the same. Like, regulation is a way of making a particular chemical visible to law. And I'm wondering how ammonia kind of, and its usages kinds of avoids that regulation or avoids the visibility.
Yeah, I think this is complex, and I don't have a. I'm excited. I'm interested to see what I say next, basically. But I've been thinking about it a lot because I think it's a commodity. It's well, it may be like a lot of other commodities, but specifically ammonia, because it has so many different uses. You know, initially, well, like the alchemists used it to try to make gold, and then like after that, you know, obviously nobody's doing that anymore. But you have this dual purpose of using it for fertilizer and for explosive. And so you see throughout history that basically like there seems to be a situation where we've invented a way to make ammonia and now we should use it. And so immediately after it was invented, the Haber-Bosch process that made it a lot faster and cheaper to make ammonia was in 2013. And then immediately you had the First World War. And so you immediately had this like diversion of a really explosive substance to go into munitions for First World War. And then as soon as the wars are over, people are like, great, now we'll put it back on fields, right? And so the ship that was that exploded in the Texas City explosion is a very large military ship full of ammonia, that the ammonia is now being sold as fertilizer, ammonium nitrate. And so you have this ability for, I think it's more like there's a logic to it that is actually similar to maybe what you're describing in terms of parasiticides, which is like you have this chemical and we should use it. And I think there's an exception and acceptance in our culture that like we invented something and it has a purpose. And so that, you know, that purpose should always just be prioritized maybe over harms or toxins or anything else. So I think you have something around like the availability of these chemicals that people basically don't know about. I think it is different than some of the climate debate around like oil and gas and things that are more visible. You have this sort of secret chemicals that are constantly being used, and the way that we're constantly being told or made to forget about the harms from that. And I think that goes to the visibility question. I think is a kind of intentional invisibility where we're not kind of encouraged or allowed or whatever, able to ask questions about, you know, do we want to use this chemical for the purposes that it's being used if we really knew everything about it?
Thanks, Olivia. And perhaps we could end by the question you put in, Olivia, to Angie. And then I think even I need to go, I think. But so Olivia asks Angie, and they say, I'm super interested in how the radical listening to the more than human world can be used. Can you share any more specifics on the method and how it can be recorded for academic purposes, given that it is such a human format and structure? And I think that's, yeah, and then you have your own thinking about ammonia methods in the background. So Angie, could you tell us a bit more about the specifics of the method of the radical listening project?
So, so as far as radical listening in terms of listening to the more than human, it's still less developed than it is, because the organization had been working on prioritizing indigenous voices, not so much on the more than human, which kind of opens up in recent years. But what they're doing is that they're using bioacoustics. That's a new technology thing. But I guess like the benefit of, I mean, I've talk to their research team, but it's an ongoing process. So they're recording in New Guinea. There's a bird of paradise. I'm not sure if you know that species, but they're quite beautiful. They're native to New Guinea. So they're recording that through bioacoustics. I mean, that's just as far as technology is concerned. But I guess like what really is at the core of radical listening, at least to me, is that it really opens up a revenue of listening to people and voices that we don't pay a lot of attention to. And as I wrote in that thesis, is about listening to the oppressed and what has historically been silenced, and also listening as a way of our embodied interconnection, which is my central argument, interbeing. So you, in a way that even if it's through bioacoustics, even though you're not in the tropical forest and you don't have to live in the tropical forest, listening to voices from the more than human world, like there was not monkey, it was actually gibbons, but that sound was gibbons. But listening to them will be a way of fostering, the care and interconnectedness that we share with them. So in a way that it opens up the dialogue on, that we're all interconnected, and how are we planning on protecting forests that are thousands of miles away from us. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Angie. And listen, I think I would love to keep talking, but I do think I need to end the event. But it was really fascinating hearing all your research. And I was very inspiring, really, in terms of all the the ambition of it all, and all the different disciplines that you're engaging with and across. So just thank you very much. There is a feedback form I've just put in the Q&A that'd be great if the audience could click on and fill in, let us know what we did well and what you'd like for the next year's festival. That would be great. Just very quickly, Kae, I'm just going to make a mental note to contact you, put you in touch with Birkbeck's estate team, because there's a bit of land that's now been earmarked for the gardening society, but also for some kind of use in research. So I wonder whether there's some link up there with the kind of
the permablitz group as well. Like we'll come and do like a little permaculture design for a piece of land like that. So it'd be really interesting.
that could be super interesting, couldn't it? So let's make sure that happens. Okay.
Nice.
Thank you everyone for your energy and your time. I really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.